I am a Colombian woman, 28 years old, married to my husband Jack. A few years ago we moved to a comfortable apartment in New Chicago. My husband works on a construction site far from the city, so we go weeks without seeing each other, although we always try to stay in touch. We have been married for 2 years, and like any marriage we have had our ups and downs. I once discovered that he had subscriptions to adult sites, and recently found chats where he was flirting with a work colleague. We are trying to improve our relationship, and I am also in therapy for eating problems and depression, which undoubtedly affected our coexistence. Everything changed a month ago when I had an accident and fractured my right leg. I stopped working, and we were forced to temporarily move to my in-laws' house because I needed help, and my husband couldn't be with me due to his job. Since I arrived at my in-laws' house, I noticed a lot of tension in the air. They argued often, and that created a somewhat uncomfortable atmosphere. My husband had already told me that his dad had been a bit of a womanizer and a bit of a troublemaker in his youth, but that he had calmed down in recent years. Seeing him, a man of over 50 years old, strong and with an imposing presence, I was not surprised to learn that in his younger years he had been a Don Juan. When my husband returned to his job at the construction site, my father-in-law began to be more attentive to me. He came to my room a couple of times a day, worried about how I was feeling, knowing that I was having a hard time both physically and emotionally. At first, I didn't give much importance to his visits. After all, I figured he was lonely too. One particular day I was very emotional and told him about my frustration over the accident and how I felt about losing my job. He looked at me with a face of concern and tenderness, told me that everything would be fine, hoved me and in a gesture that surprised me kissed my shoulder. Then he said goodbye. That gesture disconcerted me a little. But not having had a father figure, I interpreted it as something normal. I even liked it, but a few days ago, everything changed. He came into my room very early in the morning. I pretended to be asleep because I didn't feel like talking. However, he returned later when she was already awake. "Can I keep you company?" he asked me in a serious but gentle tone. I was surprised to see him so early, but I said yes. He sat next to my bed and we started talking. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from everyday topics to more personal ones. At one point, we started sharing intimate experiences and talking about crazy things we'd like to do. That's when he started telling me his fantasies in my ear. Although there was no physical contact between us, the proximity and his words created an intense atmosphere. And then, in one gentle but firm movement, he had to me. Suddenly, I found myself paralyzed as if an electric shock had coursed through my body. I wanted to move, but something inside me kept me still, confused between fear and a strange sensation that I couldn't identify. On the one hand, I didn't want to confront the situation, but on the other hand, there was something about that moment that inexplicably attracted me. His words had ignited something in me that had been dormant for a long time, that uncertainty and excitement of the unknown. When he looked me straight in the eyes with an intensity that unnerved me even more. With a soft smile he leaned towards me. I felt completely vulnerable, even sitting on the bed. He began to caress my arm gently, a gesture that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. I was wearing shorts to sleep, and although my mind screamed, my body did not respond, trapped in the moment. In one swift motion he moved closer, his breath close to my skin. I felt his hand sliding gently off my arm, crawling every inch of my skin. He had never experienced anything like that. It was as if each touch revealed a new level of sensitivity in me. Then he moved away slightly and carefully pulled up my shorts, as if he were afraid to break a spell. He said goodbye with a kiss on the forehead, leaving me there, blushing and confused, trying to process what had just happened. My husband had always been more reserved in these matters, never daring to explore beyond the conventional, always concerned about what was right. In contrast, his father seemed to understand the secrets of desire in a deeper way. The experience had been overwhelming and left me wondering about things I didn't know. In the days that followed, every time my mother-in-law left the house to run errands, the air was filled with a palpable tension. It was crazy, and I knew it, but something in me had awakened. One day, while my mother-in-law was at the market, my father-in-law came into my room. "How are you today?" he asked me in that deep voice that was now so familiar to me. Later, I responded with a small voice in my heart beating a mile an hour. "Do you need something, any help?" His insinuating tone left no doubt as to what he meant. I couldn't believe the words that came out of my mouth. "Maybe a little company." And so with those words we took another step in our secret and dangerous game. It was crazy and I knew it. My mother-in-law and my husband trusted me, and I was betraying that trust in the worst way possible. That was like an escape from my reality, a way to feel alive again, even if it was in such a twisted way. I remember one day in particular when my mother-in-law was out visiting a friend. "This is wrong," I said to my father-in-law with a feeble attempt to resist the inevitable. "I know," he replied, "but I find it impossible to get away from you," and with those words any remaining resistance vanished. Our meetings became a dark secret, a series of moments full of passion and madness. I knew it was wrong, I knew I was playing with fire, but at that moment none of that seemed to matter. However, deep down, there was always that constant fear of being discovered. I knew that if my husband or mother-in-law found out what was going on, everything would fall apart. But in that state of madness and evil, that fear only added more excitement to our dangerous adventure. One day, while my father-in-law was busy, my mother-in-law sat next to me and looked at me with concern. "How's that leg going, dear?" he asked sweetly. "Yes, thank you," I replied, feeling deep guilt as I looked into her eyes. "Recovery is going well." She nodded and then in a softer tone said, "I want you to know that you are welcome here. Are you comfortable in the house? Is there anything you need?" I thanked her and assured her it was fine, but she continued, "And tell me, have you get along with my husband? I know he can be a little intense at times, but deep down he's a good man. He even told me that he likes you very well and cares about you." His words took me by surprise. "Yes, we get along well. He's very kind and attentive, especially with my injury," I replied, trying to hide the sign of nervousness in my voice. She smiled satisfied. "I'm glad to hear that. He comes off a little serious sometimes, but he has a good heart. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay between you." The conversation continued for a while longer, talking about everyday things, but inside me the anxiety remained there. My mother-in-law's genuine concern contrasted sharply with the secret she kept. I felt trapped between gratitude towards her and the forbidden feelings that linked me to her husband. That night, while I was alone in my room, a blow of reality hit me hard. What was he doing? He was risking everything for a few moments of passion, but every time I thought about ending the whole attraction, something would drive me back into sin. And so, the days continued, each one marked by the duality of my life in that house between the affection and concern of my mother-in-law and the secret and forbidden meetings with my father-in-law. It was an unsustainable situation, and I knew that sooner or later something would have to change. One day everything changed. My mother-in-law had gone out as usual but returned earlier than expected. I was in the living room and my father-in-law, who thought we still had the house to ourselves, came into the room with a knowing smile and a particular gleam in his eye. She approached me in a slightly bolder manner than usual without realizing that his wife was about to walk through the door. Just then my mother-in-law entered the room. The expression on her face quickly changed from surprise to suspicion as she watched her husband jerk away from me. There was an awkward silence and I could feel my heart racing. "Is everything okay here?" she asked in a tone that was intended to be casual, but her questioning look at her husband said otherwise. "Yes, sure," he replied. "My dad said, I was just wondering how you felt about your leg." She nodded, but something in her eyes let me know she wasn't completely convinced. From that day on, I noticed a change in his behavior. He began to stay at home more, watching us with a look that I interpreted as a mixture of doubt and sadness. One afternoon while my father-in-law was in the garden, she sat next to me and looked me straight in the eyes. "My dear, there is something you should know about my husband," she began seriously, as he gets carried away by impulses. It's not the first time I suspected him, but I never thought that you. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Understanding dawned on my face, and I knew she had connected the dots. I'm sorry, was all I could say, my voice barely audible. Words seemed so insufficient for the magnitude of what he had done. She looked at me with a mix of disappointment and pity. I don't want this to destroy our family, he finally said. I can't let this continue. She looked at me with her eyes reflecting many emotions. You have to leave this house immediately, he said firmly. I will protect my son from this humiliation and contempt. I will not tell him what has happened, but I cannot allow you to continue here. I felt my heart shrink. I understand, I murmur, although each word was difficult. I will make up an excuse about your leaving, she continued. But I ask that you never look for my son again. What you have done has not only hurt me, but has betrayed his trust and that of our family. I nodded, unable to find the words to express my regret and the guilt that consumed me. I'm so sorry, was the only thing I managed to say. Although I knew those words could never repair the damage caused, she stood up, her posture showing determination, but her eyes did not hide the pain. You should gather your things and leave as soon as possible, she concluded before leaving the room, leaving me alone with the overwhelming weight of my actions. I gathered my things, each object a reminder of the life I was leaving behind, and the catastrophic decisions I had made. I knew that, by leaving, I was closing a chapter of my life, but also beginning another full uncertainty and regret. As I left the house, I took one last look, knowing that it was a final goodbye not only to a place, but to my husband and a part of my life that had ended abruptly. The future was uncertain, but I knew I had to face it, learning from my mistakes and trying to rebuild what was left of my life. A few months after I left, life had changed drastically. I learned that my husband had suffered greatly upon discovering my sudden absence. The story they told him was that I had left with a businessman I had met, attracted by his money and power. They said I had no respect, a story fabricated to hide the painful truth. Learning with the weight of my actions and the lie that had been told was very hard. Every day, I faced the mirror and saw the reflection of someone who had made irreparable mistakes, someone who had broken the trust and love of the people I loved most. Guilt consumed me, and the pain of knowing that I had caused my husband so much suffering was a constant burden. I was assaulted by memories of the happy moments we shared, totally contrasting with my current reality. There wasn't a day that I didn't think about my ex-husband, knowing how he was doing and if he had managed to find any comfort or if he still felt the sharp pain of betrayal. I found myself living in a small apartment, far from everything I had known. Every day was a struggle to rebuild my life, to find some meaning in the midst of the chaos I had created. I was working a modest job, trying to keep myself busy so as not to drown in my thoughts. Regret accompanied me constantly. I knew there was no justification for my actions, that I had chosen a path that destroyed the trust and love I once believed in. I often wondered if I could ever forgive myself, if I could learn from my mistakes and be a better person. And that's how my story ends, a confession of infidelity that shames and blames me to hellish levels. But what do I have to assume? Now you can judge my facts in the comments. I hope there is someone who can at least minimally understand what happened. My marriage was not as perfect as it might seem. Anyway, thank you for listening to my story until the end. Please, I ask you like the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear new disturbing stories and secret confessions. Thank you so much.